Good afternoon, and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, and I'm very pleased you could join us for today's discussion, whether you're here in person or joining us through YouTube, and a special welcome to our C-SPAN audience. Today, we're pleased to partner with the Historical Office of the Secretary of Defense to present a roundtable discussion related to the 9th volume in the Secretary's Defense Historical Series, Harold Brown, Offsetting the Soviet Military Challenge 1977 to 1981. We're honored to be joined by our special guests, former Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, Charles Duncan, and Robert O. Work, former Deputy Secretaries of Defense, and the moderator for today's discussion, Edward Keefer, author of the volume. But before we get started on today's program, I want to alert you to two other programs coming up soon here in the McGowan Theater. Tomorrow at noon, we'll screen the recent documentary Democracy's Messengers, the never-before-told story of young Americans on Capitol Hill, about the history of pages in Congress and at the Supreme Court. Following the screening, producer Jerry Papazian will moderate a discussion with former pages Frank Mitchell, Jonathan Turley, and Camilla Businkay. And on Wednesday, March 7th at noon, author Jean Abrams will be here to discuss and sign her new book, First Ladies of the Republic, Martha Washington, Abigail Adams, Dolly Madison, and the Creation of an Iconic American Role. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events at archives.gov. There are also in the lobby sign-up sheets where you can receive it by regular mail or email. In 2015, we presented a discussion based on the previous volume in the series, Melvin Laird and the Foundation of the Post-Vietnam Military, 1969 to 1973. The moderator then, as today, was Erin Mahan. Erin has been Chief Historian for the Office of the Secretary of Defense since 2010. Previously, she worked in the Center for the Study of Weapons of Mass Destruction at the National Defense University and in the Historian's Office at the U.S. Department of State. At State, she was an editor of several volumes of the Foreign Relations of the United States series related to strategic arms limitation talks, the former Soviet Union, the Vietnam War, and Korea. She's also the author of Kennedy, de Gaulle, and Western Europe, and has published several chapters and articles on biological and chemical weapons, NATO, and U.S. and French foreign economic policies during the 1960s. She was a nationally elected council member of the Society of Historians of the American Foreign Relations, 2009 to 2011, and was appointed to the National Historical Publications and Records Commission here at the National Archives. Dr. Mahan holds a PhD history from the University of Virginia, and it's now my pleasure to welcome back Dr. Mahan to our stage to introduce the panel.
Good afternoon. David, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you once again for hosting our Secretaries of Defense Historical Series book discussion. This is our third joint event, and this one is unique because we are privileged to have with us today former Secretary of Defense Harold Brown himself. And we were expected to have former Secretary William Perry, who had earlier served in Dr. Brown's Pentagon, but unfortunately, due to this horrible cold and flu season, he was unable to travel. So we are indeed grateful to Secretary Brown's former deputy, Charles Duncan, who is seated at the far end of the stage, for literally being recruited at the last minute to step in and share his insights of the period. To provide a non-Carter insider perspective, I'm delighted to introduce Robert Work, former Deputy Secretary of Defense during the Obama administration and briefly for Secretary James Mattis. Secretary Work is an architect of the Third Offset Strategy and is currently active in defense affairs for a variety of NGOs. Dr. Brown, who is seated to his left, needs no introduction. He is, so to speak, the protagonist of Dr. Keefer's book, and he continues to be active in national defense issues as well. All of our former principals on stage today have made significant contributions to national defense both during and after their tenures. To help draw out their insights and facilitate our discussion is Dr. Edward Keefer, the author of the Harold Brown volume. Dr. Keefer, before joining our office as an author, dedicated 34 years of his career to serving as an editor and then general editor of the Department of State's official documentary series, The Foreign Relations of the United States, commonly known to many of us as FRUS. His years of compiling and overseeing the FRUS series and the thousands of previously classified documents contained therein is evident in his deeply researched book under discussion today. I'm therefore pleased to turn the stage over to him in what promises to be a truly engaging conversation amongst these former officials.
Thank you, Aaron. During the 5 years I spent writing this book, I came to know Harold Brown and his defense team mainly through their official records, interviews, and their memoirs. So it's a great honor to be on the stage with him here and with Deputy Secretary Duncan, really two of the main movers and shakers of the Pentagon during the Card years. It's also gratifying to have the perspective of another Pentagon official, former Deputy Secretary Work. Now, I would like to just briefly give you a elevator ride summary of a 600-page book. The Brown administration used high technology to offset Soviet Union's advantages, numerical advantages in strategic weapons, conventional weapons, and forces. That's my first main point of the book. The second one is that Harold Brown, with some help from Congress, during the last 2 years of the Carter administration, convinced a reluctant President Jimmy Carter to spend more on defense, which reversed a trend that had been going since the end of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War of declining defense budgets. My third point in the book, third big point of the book, is that there is much more continuity than contrast between the Carter administration and the Reagan administration. And in fact, I would argue that the Carter administration laid the foundation for the Reagan administration's defense policy. As I say a couple of times in the book, the Reagan defense revolution started during the Carter administration. And the final main point I want to make is that Iran, the hostage crisis, the failed rescue mission, at least in the public's perception, has really skewered the view of the Carter administration and has essentially overshadowed its many successes. So those are the main ideas of the book. So now I'm going to just jump right into questions, and there will be time at the end of this discussion for questions, but if you have them, would you line up on either side of the aisle and go to the microphones? I want to ask the first question to Secretary Brown. The Carter administration entered an office at a time, at least when some segments of the national security community believed the Cold War balance of power was shifting in favor of the Soviet Union. Do you agree with that? And how did your understanding of the balance of power between Washington and Moscow change over the years of your term?
Well, that the Soviet Union had a very substantial program to increase its military capabilities is very clear. That had begun well before the Carter administration took office, and it continued through the Carter term. But in my judgment then, and even more clearly the case in retrospect, the U.S. was clearly well ahead of the Soviet Union in strategic forces, which is, of course, the area in which the biggest complaints were made about rapid Soviet advance by people such as those in the Committee on the Present Danger. But I was confident that we were ahead overall. For example, we ruled the seas. The Soviets really did not have an all-ocean navy or anything like it. And we were able to project power everywhere. The Soviets were also able to project power, but principally they were able to do it, and this gave them some advantages, through proxies. We didn't have any proxies. But it's true that the Soviets were building rapidly, not only, especially strategically, that is to say, with ballistic missiles, both land and sea-based. And it's also true that they had a very substantial conventional advantage, that is an advantage in conventional forces, land forces, not air forces, but land forces, in Europe. And that was troublesome. Until then, and even subsequently, the U.S. had a policy of escalating to nuclear exchange in case of a Soviet invasion, whether escalating gradually or by making a nuclear strike at the beginning. But that essentially was a way to mutual destruction, and so it wasn't very attractive. I therefore decided that we needed to improve our conventional military capabilities in Europe, and we subsequently executed such a substantial buildup. In fact, one of the first things I did, being at least an amateur student of history, my first trip to Europe after taking office, it probably was in March of 1977. I was at a defense ministers meeting in Brussels, and I took a trip across the border to Aachen. Now, Aachen, to those of you who are history buffs, happened to be the seat of Charlemagne's empire. And by doing that, I was indicating my own intention to try to build up our capabilities in Europe. Because Charlemagne's empire, though not contiguous with, was largely the same realm as NATO.
Can I ask Secretary Work a question? Do you see parallels between the national security situation during the Carter years and the Obama years?
Well, there were, obviously at the strategic level, there were two major differences. There was generally a unitary threat against the Soviet Union that really consumed the attention of the Carter administration and all the administrations before and the administrations after, until the Soviet Union imploded. We were in Afghanistan. The United States later became involved in Afghanistan, but at a much lower level of strategic effort that actually came after the Carter administration. But there were a lot of similarities in that both we had just come out of a long war in Vietnam. We're still in a long war in the Middle East. It took strategic focus away from the development of the defense program. And during that time, in Dr. Brown's time, Secretary Brown's time, the Soviet Union had really spent a lot of money on conventional forces, and the conventional balance was not to our favor. And the same thing was happening to us with a variety of different competitors, primarily our two great power competitors, Russia and China. So the key question was, how do we offset this? We wouldn't want to try to match either the Russians or the Chinese, tank for tank, airplane for airplane, ship for ship. And so we adopted very much the thinking of the Carter administration and Dr. Brown and Dr. Perry and Deputy Secretary Duncan, all of them. It was very, very analogous to the time. At least our thinking was.
Let me jump in and
Sure.
mention that although we were clearly ahead with the problem that I mentioned in Europe, however, it became clear that perceptions matter as well as facts. And the Committee on Present Danger was making quite a fuss. And at the same time, Soviet mischief-making was taking place below the level of war. And that affected perceptions because of what they did, for example, in Africa. Angola, Ethiopia became anti-American during this period. And of course, later on, Iran. So we had to respond to those perceptions, and we did so. And we did so by explaining the situation, as well as by taking the programmatic steps that we did. And we also, on the strategic side, started a new submarine-launched ballistic missile program, the Poseidon. We took some steps in the land-based ballistic missile program. Not all of them were completely sensible steps, but that happens when you get into a perceptions game.
Secretary Duncan, I wonder if you could tell us how you and Secretary Brown divided up the division of labor at the Pentagon. And the second question is, can an organization as large and as diverse as the Pentagon really be managed?
Well, moving into the Pentagon, where I've been principally in the food business, primarily the Coca-Cola Company and the coffee business, moving in there with someone like Harold Brown made all the difference in the world to me. Harold Brown knew about my capability or lack thereof in many of these programs, and he was a marvelous man to work with. Obviously extremely astute, right on top of a tremendous amount of activity as he has just outlined. One thing he did not mention was the stealth aircraft. I had the good fortune to go out to our western bases on the west coast of the United States and see the development of the first two of those aircraft, and it was extremely impressive. And I remember getting back and talking to Harold about it, speaking to Brzezinski about it, and they were terribly impressed. There were other things that we had with capability. Harold mentioned the build-up of conventional forces in Europe in his opening comments, and I remember President Carter's anxiety to get real increases after inflation in the capabilities, normal military capabilities of those countries.
This wasn't going to be a question for Secretary Perry, but he's not here, so I'm going to direct it to you, Secretary Brown. How did you decide on the offset strategy, and how supportive was the Congress in funding the technologies and programs at the core of the strategy, and how supportive was the White House?
I would be hard put to describe the exact process of decision because it was so long ago, and we're all subject to what the French call l'esprit de l'escalier, which translates to what you think as you go down the stairs. And what it means is that as you do that after a meeting, you realize what you should have said and what you should have done. And over time, you convince yourself that that's what you did say and what you did do. So I can't say exactly how it generated. But it did become clear that we would not be able to match Soviet manpower in Europe and ground force power. It's true that the Europeans, in principle, had just as many troops, but they were nowhere near the condition that ours were, even after the Vietnam War and its depredations, let alone matching the Soviets. So we had to find a way to augment our capabilities. And we did it by this offset strategy because we wanted to come closer to matching Soviet ground capabilities so as to raise the nuclear threshold. The Europeans, having essentially thrown up their hands at that prospect, wanted to rely on our strategic forces. At the same time, they had a horror, as we did, of their ever being used. And to get around that conundrum, we took several steps to produce this offset strategy. One, of course, was the quality of our technical capabilities, giving ourselves a much greater capability for a given force. For example, by precision-guided munitions, which allowed us to have a much greater potential effect with the air forces and also ground forces that we had in Europe. Another initiative that we took was roll-on, roll-off ships, which would allow us rapidly to reinforce the equipment present in Europe. We could fly the troops over, and in principle at least, their equipment would be stored but ready to use and could be unloaded. Now, that said, there's a lot of detail between the time you say that and the time you get the capability, and indeed, matching them up would not be done in an instant either, even though both were present in the European theater. So that's another example of things that we did. And all of that was directed to raise the threshold for nuclear war, which made sense to the Europeans, although it worried them, because they said, well, when you do that, it means that the Russians, the Soviets, may think that you're prepared to fight a a non-nuclear war in Europe, and they don't want that either. I mean, or rather, the Europeans don't want that either. Nor, of course, did we. So we're in this strange position, which nuclear strategy always puts you in. You don't want to go to a nuclear war, but every step that you take to put that off means it's more likely you'll fight a conventional war. In the end, I think we did the right thing. I think we both increased our conventional deterrence against the Soviets and at the same time took care of our nuclear capability. Although in my last annual report, the one published in January after we had left office, made the point that in my personal opinion, the chances of avoiding escalation to all-out war by establishing a series of tactical uses and gradual escalation were not very great. In fact, I doubted that a conventional war could be kept from escalating to a nuclear war in Europe. Now, of course, what's happened is that the Russians under Putin have more or less adopted that point of view after having, for a time, joined us in saying, saying that they would not use nuclear weapons. Our position was we wouldn't use them unless they were used against us or an ally. The Russians are now saying they're ready to fight a limited nuclear war. Well, I doubt that a limited nuclear war between us and the Russians is a realistic possibility.
Secretary Work, you sort of hinted at this before, but what lessons did you take from the offset strategy, Brown and Perry's offset, during your years in defense? And is the concept really applicable today? You think it's applicable?
Oh, it's definitely applicable. I had the great good fortune of talking with Dr. Perry, who can't be here today. Keep the mic. I'm sorry. I had the great good fortune of talking with Dr. Perry before I became the deputy, and we had a long discussion of the thinking behind the offset strategy. Dr. Perry actually calls it a holding strategy because it was all predicated on the assumption that we needed to wait until the Soviet Union collapsed under its own contradictions. I also was able to talk with Paul Kaminsky. The key things that I took away from those conversations was it had to be top-down driven. It had to come from the Secretariat. Left to their own devices, the military departments would not embark upon these things. 2 examples. The only reason the GPS, the Global Positioning System constellation, exists today is because Dr. Perry forced it. Everyone concluded that it might be a good idea, but it was too expensive, and so everyone was waiting to stop funding it. The F-117 stealth fighter that Deputy Secretary Duncan talked about, it competed against the Air Force F-15, F-16, and A-10 aircraft, which were their major program elements in terms of their modernization program, and we wouldn't have the F-117 as fast as we had gotten it unless Dr. Perry pulled it up. The other thing we took away from the discussions is the Carter administration and Dr. Brown looked at the strategic level. You know, they started the Peacekeeper program, the Trident program. And the big offset was at what is called the operational level of war, the campaign level. And generally, that's easiest to think of is we were going to look deep and shoot deep, and we were going to hit whatever we shot at. And so we had to have sensors that could look deep behind the forward line of troops so we could see where the Soviet Union were marshaling their forces and then attack them with guided munitions. So that was at the operational level of war. The other thing that is not well understood is at the tactical level, there was a big modernization program. There was the Army had what was called the Big Five. That was the M1 Abrams tank, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the multiple launch rocket system, the Patriot surface-to-air missile, and the Apache attack helicopter. All of those were developed under the Carter administration. They were ready for production when the Reagan defense buildup started. And so at the tactical level, we were getting much, much better at the point of attack. At the operational level, we were disrupting Soviet forces deep, and at the strategic level, we were building upon our already considerable advantages. The other thing we took away from is that the Carter administration revealed some capabilities for deterrence, and they concealed some capabilities for warfighting advantage. Everyone now knows we had the stealth fighter, but that was a program that was not really talked about and not really acknowledged. What was acknowledged was our ability to shoot deep and look deep and shoot deep. So we took that away also. So most of the thinking that Secretary Brown and Dr. Perry and Deputy Secretary Duncan, we just essentially applied today. Probably not as well as them, but we took a lot away from what they did.
This is
Let me
Oh, yeah, jump in.
Let me interject something. These things take decades. I recall from an earlier era than my own service as Defense Secretary that during the Vietnam War, during which I was first Director of Defense Engineering and then Secretary of the Air Force, we had begun working on precision delivery. We had electro-optical systems. We had various other guidance systems to try to hit the target rather than scattering bombs over the landscape. They were very primitive. Our attempts to destroy the bridges in North Vietnam didn't really work, but it was those systems which were just coming into fruition when the war ended that developed into successful precision guidance systems later on during subsequent administrations. So no single administration, even if it lasts 8 years, is able to bring things from the idea stage into the deployment stage and, if necessary, combat stage. And it's difficult to assure continuity from one to the next. But it's essential if the improvements that we've all been talking about are to be made.
I want to talk about Iran, because for better or worse, the Carter administration's legacy has been entangled with Iran. And I wonder, Secretary Duncan, if you could just describe your trip in late 1978 to Iran, which I think is a really interesting experience.
My wife and I and some military people went to Iran. This was just before the Shah of Iran left Iran. When we got to Tehran first, there was a tremendous amount of military activity every night. We stayed in the American Embassy. Ann was with me on that trip. We then went to Isfahan and we went to Shiraz, and the same thing was going on in those activities there. In fact, on one of the trips going to a military function at one of the air bases, Ann's car was stopped temporarily by Iranian military, and there were some exciting experiences that we had there. But we stayed right on top of that. We tried to bring the Iranians along. The American military at that time had been working with the Iranian military, but when Khomeini arrived from France and that regime changed, all of that activity ceased, and that was followed by the hostage crisis and things like that, which we eventually had more to do on that, which you may mention later.
This is a question, I guess, for anyone, but maybe starting with Secretary Brown. Was the hostage rescue mission failure a failure of planning, equipment, training, or was it just bad luck? How would you characterize it?
Well, there was some bad luck, but that was not the reason that it failed. I think the first problem was that this was a very difficult operation. And it became urgent in part because the president correctly felt personally responsible for the lives of the hostages. It was very important to him and to the rest of us that we not make them casualties. You know, it's true and an interesting thing to note that there were no troop casualties during the Carter administration. Yes, there were those that died in the desert, in Desert One, from accident. And if there had been a successful rescue attempt, there would have been combat casualties. But unlike any administration, all the way back through the 1930s, I guess all the way back to the Hoover administration, the Carter administration did not, and I looked it up on internet, so it must suffer any combat casualties, all the way up to right now. So he cared a lot. Still, I think in retrospect, it was a mistake to hole up in the White House and not travel, because it produced this enormous pressure for a rescue attempt, which in the end had to be undertaken at short notice. And that was one of the problems. But I think the fundamental tactical and planning problems were, first, that we didn't practice. We didn't practice because we were too concerned, and I include myself in this, that practicing would tip the Iranians or tip off the Russians, who would then notify the Iranians that we were planning a rescue attempt. Because they sure didn't expect, and that worked, because the Iranians sure didn't expect it. We know that. But it probably, in retrospect, would have been worth that risk in order to practice. And that problem was made worse by the fact that the planners, and probably affected by the feelings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, managed to involve all of the services in the activity, including services that hadn't worked together at this before, hadn't practiced. Now, because of the plan was what it was, inevitably there would have had to be some inter-service participation. But, you know, again, in retrospect, to have Marine helicopters instead of Air Force helicopters work with the Air Force transport that was involved and with the Army unit that was going to do the rescue, which had already worked with Air Force people, was a mistake. So put those things together, and the fact that, put it together with the fact that this was not going to be an Entebbe-style rescue, its chances were less than they should have been. An Entebbe style would have been great if only the Iranians had put the hostages at an airport instead of where they were. It was ill-starred. We made mistakes. I made mistakes. And I took responsibility for mistakes. On the trip down to the secret place in Virginia where the rescue team, where the Delta Force was, both Zbig Brzezinski and I, who went down there with the president afterwards, offered our resignations. He refused. He said, "No, I want you both to stay." Secretary Vance, of course, had resigned, having opposed the rescue attempt for various reasons. But in fact, he had, I know, decided to resign well before the decision was made to rescue the hostages, and for other reasons.
Could I just,
Yeah, please jump in.
I was a second and first lieutenant during this time frame in the U.S. Marine Corps, and I'd just like to echo Dr. Brown's point. The military that our citizens know today is nowhere like the military that existed between '75, when we adopted the all-volunteer force, through the time we adopted the Goldwater Nichols Act, which really started to go after forcing the services to work more closely together in a joint manner. And the Mayaguez incident, where again, another rescue attempt, it was exactly the opposite. There were Air Force helicopters carrying in Marines rather than Marine Corps helicopters operated with the Air Force. Both of them were just beyond the capability of the military at the time. We know this in retrospect. It wasn't as evident then, maybe, but the lack of training together as a unified joint team, cobbling together forces from different types of services, it was not the ideal application of military power. So I echo everything that Secretary Brown says.
Yeah, we learned really right away, because we established the joint force activity at Tampa almost immediately thereafter, and we instituted a promotion requirement, which may since have been overdone, that before becoming a flag or general officer, you had to have done joint duty. So we understood why it had not worked, and we took initial steps which came to fruition with Goldwater Nichols a few years later.
I believe that the last president to not suffer any combat casualties before Jimmy Carter was Theodore Roosevelt, which is somewhat ironic. And I have a question for any of the panelists, but National Security Advisor Brzezinski said that the Nixon administration proposed to China, but we, the Carter administration, consummated the marriage. I'd like you to look back at that budding relationship with China during the Carter years and the so-called China card that Brzezinski was always keen to play, as well as to look and see how our relationship with China has evolved since that time. I don't know. Do you want to start, Secretary Brown?
Yes. The first mention of the possibility of a rapprochement with China by the United States that I recall in official circles actually came in the late 60s when at a Defense Policy Board meeting I heard Paul Nitze say, we're number one, the Soviets are number two, the Chinese are becoming number three, and the right thing to do is for number one and number three to combine against number two in international strategy. Now, a lot of things that Paul did and said later, I disagreed with. Many I agreed with, but that one really struck me at the time. And in a way, of course, it is what came to pass. We struck a deal with what was then number three, now clearly number two, and we have a somewhat different attitude toward them, and they toward us. But from that point, which was, I guess, probably 1968 or so, that gradually came to pass. The Nixon trip was the big trip. I guess Henry Kissinger would say his trip was the big trip. And we followed up during the Carter administration. I did not play a leading role in that, but there were some things I had to do to help it along. We had to bring the Joint Chiefs along. If the Joint Chiefs had said, we can't go along with that, it would have been much more difficult to establish diplomatic relations because the Chinese had set as a condition of establishing diplomatic relations that we sever formal ties with Taiwan. And the Navy in particular had some problems with that because they actually had some forces based in Taiwan. So it was my task to, having fully supported the idea myself to get the Joint Chiefs to come along with the idea. Now, my experience with the chiefs was that during the weekly meetings in what's called the tank, the place on the first floor where they have their conference room, they took positions which to me, at least, seemed much more sensible than what they would put forth in their formal papers, which had to be agreed at every level up to the top and were accordingly full of service, of military service objectives, plans, and so forth. When you got them in the tank, the chiefs would speak as individuals often, although they sometimes had watchers watching them. And so it proved in this case. In particular, Bob Barrow, who was then the Commandant of the Marine Corps and who had actually served in China toward the end of World War II, at the cleanup there, at the very end, where we had Marines in China. I guess maybe as part of General Marshall's attempt to bring the Chinese communists and the nationalists together. I may have that wrong. He said, this makes a lot of sense. And that helped bring the Navy along to accepting the idea that they'd have to give up their base on China. So I had played that role, and the chiefs signed on with some conditions which made sense. The Congress probably added some conditions that made less sense. So the next thing that happened in that regard was that during his visit to China, which took place, I guess, after Brzezinski's, Vice President Mondale had agreed or suggested that I, as Secretary of Defense, be a visitor to China. Cy Vance, who I guess was in many ways my closest friend at cabinet level in the Carter administration, objected. He was concerned that the Soviets would take this as the beginning of an alliance between the U.S. and China, which to some degree was a correct perception on Cy's part, less so perhaps on the Soviets' part. And in any event, I did get to go. I visited China, I guess it was in January of '09. I'm sorry, of '79. And, no, of 80.
80,
Of
yes.
80, of 1980. And that was a useful visit. Later followed by a visit by the person who became the Chinese defense minister, Gongbiao. And my recollection is, I still have to go back and look up the list of people, that he was accompanied by a then 20-year-old Deng Xiaoping. No, I'm sorry, not Deng Xiaoping, the present Chinese ruler. So that's the part I played.
Maybe the other two panelists could jump in. Looking at the relationship, as it started in the 1980, the Carter years in 1980, how do you think it's evolved over the years? Have the Chinese really been, and our relationship been as successful as we hoped it was going to be?
This was pretty much a shotgun marriage in the Cold War. Both
exactly
these strategic competitors viewed the Soviet Union with great distrust, and it made a lot of sense strategically for them to have a rapprochement. After the Cold War ended, the United States adopted a policy that we would not contain China's rise, and our thinking was, I think everybody here knows, that over time, as they lifted more of their population out of poverty and into the middle class, became an integral part of the global trading system, that their policies would moderate and would become, in essence, a de facto partner of the United States in keeping the Washington consensus going. And I think that was a flawed assumption from the very beginning. I think China had a different idea of the advantages of growing their economy. And we were hamstrung, quite frankly, when I started as the Undersecretary of the Navy in 2009. We could not use the word competition and China in the same sentence. We were unauthorized to do so. The thinking of the Obama administration, anyway, was that competition was an inherently negative term. And I think that hamstrung our thinking. The Chinese clearly thought they were in a competition with the United States. And when you come at it where you don't view it as a competition and one side does, I think it doesn't turn out the way that you hope. So I think right now there is a much greater appreciation that we were in a long-term strategic competition with China. I wouldn't call them an adversary. I'd call them a geopolitical rival, strategic competitor. And as far as the Department of Defense goes, we consider them the pacing threat. In other words, they are developing such advanced capabilities that we want to make sure that we can stay abreast of them and even better, a little bit ahead of them, so to strengthen conventional deterrence. So I think right now our bet did not really turn out the way we thought it might, and we recognize we're in a competition and we're approaching it, I think, in the correct way now.
Yeah, and Xi Jinping, who, as I said, may actually have been a visitor along with the group that came to visit us in early 1950. Sorry. 80. I really am confusing things.
Let me ask one final question for both Secretary Brown and Secretary Duncan. Looking back from the vantage point of 40 years, what do you consider your major accomplishments as well as your major disappointments? Maybe Secretary Duncan, could you start
Yeah,
off?
sure. Yeah.
Well, I think I enjoyed personally working very closely with Errol Brown. I think he was a distinguished scholar, that he was a very astute thinker on geopolitical issues, and I think his recommendations made during my working relationship with him were extremely formidable. And I think that I look back on those years as having been good years for the defense effort of the United States. And I think that Harold Brown is due a tremendous amount of credit for having done that.
First of all, I guess I would want to say, looking back, that I have never worked with or seen anybody else work with such a talented and dedicated group of people who were my colleagues while I was Secretary of Defense. That starts with Charles Duncan and after him Graham Claytor as deputies. It certainly includes Bill Perry, whose leadership not only as a researcher and developer, as R&E, as Undersecretary for R&E, but whose subsequent service as Defense Secretary has not been excelled by anyone before or since. What lessons do I draw? Well, actually, in international terms, from the perspective of almost 40 years since I served as Defense Secretary, I think about our foreign policy and defense policy as perhaps deserving a lighter hand than we have sometimes shown, especially in geographical areas and ideological areas where we lack close knowledge. Of course, among our scholars at universities, there is more knowledge, but perhaps less immediate, less day-to-day, and so even they are only a limited resource. I think it's very important to regain soft power by reaching a domestic truce between the red religion and the blue religion as they have become. We've got a lot of domestic problems. They're not going to be solved, certainly, by anything that we do in international terms. We've been through those before. Domestic division in international affairs is not a new phenomenon. But then, as now, our international security rested on our domestic economic strength and our domestic consensus, domestic comity, if you want to call it that. In the 40s and 60s, in the 40s, you'll recall the division over the European involvement. In the 60s, Vietnam. Right now, there's probably less international division, except on economic issues, than there was in some earlier times. So we need to heal domestically, even while we try to manage our international involvements. When I look at Afghanistan, I don't see any ending to it. And So I have a problem with just going on doing what we're doing. I think we do need to have either a clearer outcome or a lesser involvement in many cases. Now, below those global issues, there are lots of other issues. In terms of defense, re-engaging the private sector, and especially the technology part of the private sector. Certainly, Secretary Carter, Ash Carter, really made an effort at that, and I hope it gets followed through. I think it's important, I'm now talking about more parochial issues, to slim down the headquarters in DOD, both at the OSD level and in the service levels, military department levels. In OSD, when I was secretary, now it's starting to sound like the 90-year-old I am. There was a deputy secretary, 2 undersecretaries, and I think 7 assistant secretaries. There now is a secretary, a deputy secretary. There are now at least 5, maybe 7 undersecretaries. And at the assistant secretary level, there are probably about 20. This is part of a general flabification in government. There are deputy and undersecretaries everywhere in the government now, when there didn't used to be. In part, this is just bureaucracy doing its thing. In part, it's a response to what's happened in Congress. There used to be congressional staff at about 1/5 the size that there is now. And to match people in the legislative branch, the Defense Department and other departments just add levels and add people. And I'm not sure what the way out of this is. Usually these are only solved by revolution, and I just do not see that. And so Congress has to do the same thing, and it's going to be very difficult to get around this. I think it's important to have stable budgets in defense, and I think that this latest agreement at least gives you a couple of years of that. But you need 10 years, as I said, to do any new thing, because it takes a long time in defense. I think that's enough. I've said more than enough.
Thank you
Thank you very much.
Something real quick.
Yeah, just quick.
Even though it takes a long time to develop the capabilities, as Secretary Brown says, this is a lot about perception. And in 1977, when we said we're going to demonstrate our capability to look deep and shoot deep, and we're going to do that through an advanced technology and capabilities demonstration called a salt breaker. And we did that. We did it in 1982 based on all the work that was done from 77 until that time. And we know that the offset worked because in 1984, General Ogarkov, Marshal Ogarkov, who was the head of the Soviet General Staff, said, oh my gosh, the Americans actually can do what they said they were going to do. They can look deep and shoot deep. And the way he described it was, the Americans can now achieve the same effects with conventional guided munitions than they could with tactical nuclear weapons. And it completely unsettled Soviet campaign planning. And so, without a doubt, the offset strategy and thinking worked. And in my view, looking back, was absolutely central to ending the Cold War.
That's a very good point. And I knew Ogarkov pretty well. He was a pretty tough character.
Well, thank you very much, panel. I'd now like to open it up to questions. If you have a question, would you please go to one of the two microphones, and you can ask whatever you want. So you want to go first?
Yes.
Please
Thank you.
do.
All three of you, I believe, have had extensive experience in both government and business. It's sometimes said that government should run, that the Defense Department in particular, should be run like a business. What's your perspective on that judgment?
You better repeat the question.
He's
because
asking, should
I've
government
grown deaf in my government service.
should government be run like a business? That's the essential question. You've
Well-
all had experience in business. Should government be run like a business?
I actually wrote an essay on this about a year after I left the Defense Department, and I gave a talk in Michigan about it. I don't think that the government can be run like a business. It's not a business. It doesn't have a bottom line. But I do think that it can adopt some principles of business. Efficiencies can be worked as they are in business. It's very difficult to do because, and again, I'll talk about defense in these terms. Unless, and even in that case, but certainly unless the Congress sees an overriding and immediate threat, it is going to look to the substantial degree on defense as a source of income for its constituents, its individual constituents. And in the old days, where the congressional leadership had long tenure, and the committees had long tenure, the committee chairman had long tenure, you had people like George Mahon, Richard Russell, John Stennis. They would take care of their constituencies, but they had long experience and they knew the subject. Now, the House Armed Services Committee has 60-odd people on it, each of which thinks of defense, or almost all of whom think of defense as a pot of money for their districts. That's tough. That's a tough situation to operate in. A business that had a 535-member board of directors would have a tough time. So you can't run it as a business, but you can learn and try to respond in as efficient a way as the Congress bureaucracy, whom I'm not meaning to denigrate. I think the one is the first article in the Constitution for a very good reason. And the other includes many dedicated civil servants. You can work with it, essentially, and that's the best you can do.
Over here, please.
Mike Vasulo, OSD Historical Office. Dr. Brown, can you speak to how your experience as DDR&E, Secretary of the Air Force, and a delegate to the SALT talks informed OSD's approach to SALT II? Thank you.
I think arms control is an important constituent of our security. To a degree, well, I think if you look at the strategic competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, it's clear that both sides had many more nuclear weapons than had any rational explanation. We and they were responding to each other by insisting that we not be outgunned in a situation where a few guns is enough. There was overkill, essentially, or certainly the potential for enormous overkill. Now, I'm not one to say that, 100 is enough or 300 is enough. Because preemption is a real concern at those levels. At thousands, it's not. And it was important, and even in some cases reasonably successful, that there were arms negotiations that first kept things from getting probably 3 times as bad as they were in terms of numbers, and finally did begin to bring the numbers down. They are substantially less, even more on our side than on their side, because they have not given up their tactical weapons, and we have given up most of ours out of a belief that they are more likely to cause escalation than to damp it down. So I think it's important that we resume nuclear arms negotiations with the Russians, who have now adopted the view that we once had, that it's important to have many tactical weapons, and that we should initiate nuclear arms control work, negotiations with the Chinese, who have not hitherto built up anything like the numbers that we and the Soviets have right now, but could well begin to, absent such negotiations.
Next question, please.
I'm Christina Hansen. I'm a master's candidate at American University. And first of all, I'd like to thank this whole panel for your outstanding service to the defense of our nation. I'm wondering, with the buildup of missile defense capabilities that for the United States are at about 50% to 97% reliability, depending on who you ask. Do you believe that the potential for states to use nuclear weapons and their deterrent effect might potentially be eroding? And if that is the case, do you think that the next conflict that we see, should it occur, will be primarily based on conventional weaponry and possibly even tactical nuclear weapons?
I do not think that anti-missile anti-strategic ballistic missile defenses will work effectively against the U.S., the Russians, or when they get to their full strategic capabilities, the Chinese. I think the chances of them working against North Korea are pretty good. I think that, what was the rest of the question?
Sorry. Do you think that the next conflicts that we see will be primarily utilizing conventional warfare and potentially even tactical nuclear weapons?
I think that tactical nuclear weapons aren't going to work. I mean, they are likely to escalate into strategic war, and I think the Russians are making a mistake if they think otherwise. And it's also not clear how well they work against ground forces, especially if those are engaged in urban warfare, for example. So I think nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, in my judgment, are not the solution to anything.
Secretary Work, do you want to add anything to that?
Bob?
Well, first, I agree with Secretary Brown that I think ballistic missile defenses against small stockpile nations like the DPRK, the North Koreans, will be quite effective. And I think they're probably more effective than reasonably thought of now. But I totally agree that in a major exchange, they're not going to make a material difference in the outcome of that. The whole idea of the third offset, because we know that the Russians have, or at least discuss, a strategy of escalate to de-escalate and maybe demonstrate tactical nuclear weapons early in a conflict, primarily to freeze where it is. And the whole idea of the third offset is to try to raise the nuclear threshold as much as we can. But as Dr. Brown said, the Russians are kind of where we were in the 50s and the 60s, where they believe that they are conventionally outmanned, or they believe that they're conventionally disadvantaged against NATO and the United States, and therefore they have to rely upon tactical nuclear weapons as a credible deterrent. But the third offset hopefully will raise the strategic threshold, or raise the threshold for nuclear use, because I agree, once you start throwing tactical nuclear weapons around, the risks of it escalating are just too great to really pursue. And we hope to be able to convince the Russians that that is the case.
Thank you so much.
Next question, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Tom Lassman from the Smithsonian Institution. This was an excellent panel, and thank you. And I'd just like to ask a question for Secretary Brown. You mentioned toward the end here about the bloated management structure at OSD with the proliferation of undersecretaries and assistant secretaries. And I wanted to ask you if you could speak to that, but talk about it from the perspective of what you did before you came to the Defense Department. You were president of Caltech for 8 years before you came to DOD. And I wanted to know, given that Caltech was a small institution, a world-class institution, you took over from Lee Dubridge, you'd been president for 25 years. Is there anything that you brought from that experience running Caltech to your management style at the Defense Department?
As you say, Caltech is a much smaller institution even than most universities, almost all universities. And it's elite. I tried to replicate the quality, at least, that I had experienced at Caltech. I brought in a mixture of people I knew and people I didn't, and I think that makes sense. Sometimes new secretaries of defense try to take their entourage with them from wherever they come, and that's not always the best idea. I mean, of the senior people, I hadn't met Charles Duncan until we joined the Defense Department together, and that worked out great. I had met Graham Claytor, but not in any business connection. We both turned up at a social meeting together many years before. I had met Bill Perry once. I did not know Bob Comer, who played a very substantial and positive role. So that mixture makes sense to me. And I think I tried actually to slim down the personnel of the number of people in the Office of Secretary of Defense. Some of it was just moving chairs around, moving some people outside, but they were still there. But I did reduce the number of direct reports. I tried to get rid of, well, no, I tried to downgrade the Health Affairs Assistant Secretary to Deputy Secretary. The Congress wouldn't let me do that. It seems to me that, and I tried to double hat some people for the same reason, and I did get to do that. I think the number of direct reports I had when I came in was like 50, and I think I probably reduced it to 35, which isn't much of a reduction. It was the best I could do. That was my organizational attitude, and it's one that I had actually brought with me from Caltech, although I'd seen it before in defense when I was there in the 1960s. That was just my management style, and it made sense for me.
This question gets back to the first question on if you can run it as a business. And based on my own experience, Congress has moved beyond, in my view, what I consider to be good oversight, which is their job, and into micromanagement. Most of the assistant secretaries and undersecretaries have been dictated to the department through legislation. Budget instability, since 2009, we've been in a continuing resolution 30 to 40% of the time, which means that right now we have an 8-month fiscal year. The National Defense Authorization Act is now 1,600 pages long. So there are ways in which you have to operate as a business, primarily in cross-enterprise business operations. We can do a lot more there. We can do a lot better in cost accounting and get to full auditability of the department. So there are aspects of business that we should be pursuing aggressively, and I know my successor, Patrick Shanahan, is really going after these things in a big, big way. But no business would be able to survive under the conditions that the department operates on a daily basis, primarily because of budget instability, not approving or confirming the people who should run the department, and dictating organization after organization after organization, where you're just in a constant organizational churn rather than thinking about the things that Dr. Brown thought about when he was the secretary.
When I arrived in 1961 as Director of Defense Research and Engineering, was the first year that the RDT&E account, Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation, required an authorization from the authorizing committee. They did require an appropriation, but the appropriations lines, the number of appropriation lines was perhaps 24. Now it's probably 2,000.
Well, no more questions? Well, I'd like to thank the panel. I'd like to thank the audience.